Okay, everyone, this is part 3 of Extra Credits History of Paper Money, and we're doing a response slash critique of Extra Credits' take of uh, paper money systems. And in the first episode, they were very critical of commodity currency and seemed to put a very pro paper money, pro fractional reserve banking bent on their writing. The second one seemed a lot more balanced about portraying the negatives that would come about, and there was actually two heads of state that had to be executed in their historical accounts due to defrauding the populace by inducing hyperinflation by printing money. So we're going to watch the third section here and see if we can find the rat. I mean, I am trying to, I'm not being any, pretending I'm being unbiased here. I'm trying to find how they can justify these incorrect moral claims that they've made about the superiority of the paper money system and rectify that with the fact that, well, yeah, the people had to execute two leaders essentially for grand theft against the entire populace. So let's see how they turn this around with the moral trap they've already seemed to put themselves in. Let's see.
The last episode, we got to the ad hoc, unofficial beginnings of paper money. This week, we look at some of the rogues gallery that really created the intellectual argument for adopting paper money in some more official way. When we last left off in England in 1640, the first unofficial banknotes were starting to circulate. But in the early 1660s in Stockholm, the first semi-official banknotes, the first banknotes from what we might think of as a central bank, the first banknotes that really started to replace a hard currency, began to appear.
Ooh, what is it about a central bank rather than a private bank that lends legitimacy? Wouldn't the legitimacy be based on the effectiveness of what is going on? Like, if you had a regular private banknote and the bank is run efficiently and you can exchange that banknote for hard currency at any given time and there's no problems in that system, wouldn't that be your definition of legitimacy rather than looking for some kind of approval from an arbitrary and changeable authority to be the definition of official or legitimate? Legitimacy is based on, in my mind, the ability for the thing to actually do what it says it can do and not on who is saying it. And in this case, he's picked out central banks as more authoritative than private banks, which seems arbitrary to me. Let's continue.
But with those banknotes come the problem of unregulated fractional reserve banking. Remember how we mentioned that the goldsmiths of London realized that using banknotes they could actually lend out more money than they had gold or silver to cover? Well, in Stockholm, they really went to town. Soon, there were so many banknotes out there that people couldn't help but notice. And as soon as people noticed, everybody rushed to the bank to get their banknotes turned back into coins, which...
Yup. Yeah, there it is. I mean, I'm glad they're being honest about this, but I just don't see how they are going to be able to turn this corner and get to the positions that they made in the first video.
Of course they couldn't do, and there goes the Swedish economy. So clearly there were still some kinks to work out with these newfangled banknotes. Now let's hop back to England, one civil war and half a dozen other wars after Charles I so politely jump-started this whole banking thing with that forced loan of his. The year is 1695. The English have just gotten themselves kicked around in the Channel by the French, and if we know anything about history, we know that that will never do. So the English establish a central bank, the Bank of England, to raise money and to help the government pay to refit the navy. As part of this, they issued banknotes. But the idea of banknotes and their role in the economy had been a topic of debate in England for a few years, which leads us to the first of our roguish economic theorists, and yes, this is his real name, Nicholas, if Jesus Christ had not died for thee, thou hadst been damned, Barebone, who, for obvious reasons, went by the name Nicholas Barbon. Nicholas Barbon's father was, praise God, Barebone. Yes, really, who will surely make an appearance in episodes covering the English Civil War. Nick Barbon started his career as a doctor, getting his degree from the University of Utrecht and joining the Royal College of Physicians. But this trade had too much saving people and too little amassing vast quantities of wealth, so Nicholas turned instead to real estate and construction. Luckily, he hit a break when, in 1666, the Great Fire of London swept through and incinerated about 13,000 homes and left about a sixth of the city homeless. Huzzah! This, of course, was seen as a great opportunity by Barbon, who would rebuild most of London and even, very illegally, reshape it. If you
There's just kind of a subtle negative context presented with, people doing legitimate, apparently, construction work. I mean, this guy could turn out to be an asshole, but the whole idea of you needing to buy a house and someone selling it to you, if you're trying to be a moral crusader and act like that is not legitimate or necessary, you're kind of venturing into crazy commie land. And if you're honest with history, we all know where that leads, and that's the Gulag. Let's continue.
ever been to the western parts of the Strand or Bloomsbury? Those areas basically exist because Barbon didn't listen to any of the restrictions that said that you couldn't build between London and Westminster. After all, as he saw it, that's where the open land was, where easier to build. I mean, yeah, it's open because it's illegal to build there, but what are they gonna do, tear down the houses he just built? They're already built, deal with it. And from there, the sky was the limit. Barbon first got into the reputable business of selling fire insurance in a town that had just burnt down. After that, he realized that he
Okay, do you have a problem with people who sell fire insurance?
could invent the mortgage. I mean, I can't say that he was absolutely the first person to really invent the modern mortgage, but he certainly was the first major player to do so in England.
Again, do you have a problem with mortgages? I mean, I have a problem with people getting too much house than they can afford to pay for because of loose lending standards or governments forcing people to make the banks to make those loans because they seem progressive when they loan to, say, poor minorities or something like that. But if you've got current stable income and you want to do a mortgage, is there really a problem with that? I don't see it. Let's keep going.
He created the National Land Bank and began to issue loans secured by people's homes or property. He followed that up with a few stints in Parliament, largely to avoid prosecution. Then he retired to write some books. And it's really the books that we are interested in, and the thoughts he put in them. Because while I have been joking about his wild and rapacious greed, he was highly intelligent, and it's kinda hard to write him off as evil. All of
Thank you. You can stop with your commie shit then. Let's keep going.
these things he did actually ended up having positive effects, and his writing sort of shows that he knew that. Insuring people against fire provided him with a guaranteed profit, but also created a great deal more stability for the English economy. Fires were still a major issue, but no longer would they be a massive economic displacement. Instead, everybody would put some money into the pot to bail out whoever lost their home or trade to a fire, and he would skim a little from the top. Great for the economy. And mortgages? While we might today think of them as the bank's way of keeping us down, so much of England's wealth was locked up in real estate that it was a huge drag to the national economy. When people bought a house, that money just stayed locked up in that house. It didn't circulate through the economy, it didn't help to finance businesses, it just sat there until somebody generations later decided to sell it. But
There's a different philosophy about whether you should be able to secure money against your homestead. And a lot of I think Texas was one of the very last places where you had protection for your basic home, not for like second and third homes or business property, but the idea that you could effectively gamble away your own living house just because you wanted to. it's being presented as a positive here, but it's not necessarily always a positive because, as we can see, if you don't have a stable living environment and you're constantly desperate to meet an increased monthly payment in order to just maintain the roof over your head. I mean, it's bad enough that you would have to do it in the first place, but basically the stability afforded someone that owns their own home and allowing that individual to make choices that if they were more desperate and they needed to do something more desperately to maintain that lifestyle, it's not necessarily a positive there. Basically, you just get this increasingly desperate population that isn't working towards the goal of providing a stable environment for themselves, and they just become, this guy that looks like really ragged.
With the idea of the mortgage, the single biggest asset that most people owned was now freed up to help drive the economy.
And let's hope he didn't use that to go on a cruise or buy an iPod or something else frivolous, and now he has to work another 30 years just to keep the roof over his head before, he dies.
Instead of the seller simply getting a pile of cash and the buyer getting an unspendable house, the mortgage freed up that value. You could now spend your house and live in it too, meaning that money could circulate through the economy again and again. And Barbin was also, of course, one of the first people to decouple morality and spending. Which totally sounds evil, I admit, but up until this point, a lot of the writing on money was written by the church, basically arguing that everybody live the simplest life possible. And that's probably good advice in a lot of ways, but it doesn't make for a dynamic economy.
And I'm not gonna try to defend church morality, but a person that is constantly in debt, I mean, I went over this before, so I won't belabor it too much, is a desperate person. And if you're a desperate person, it stands to reason that you are going to be more inclined to engage in what would be considered vices back then. So if you're desperate to pay off a loan, you might become a thief, or you might commit fraud, or you might do any other nasty number of things that the church would consider a negative because of the desperate situation you put yourself in due to misspending your money. So to imply that there's no moral aspect to spending, I mean, I don't know. He's not saying no. I mean, that there's none, but there definitely is a moral aspect to spending. And when you are misspending and you bring misfortune and desperation upon yourself, then you have done something bad.
Barbin argued for fashion and innovation because they get people to buy new goods before they've fully consumed the previous goods,
which we judge based on their ability to actually output what they claim to output. So if you just buy a fashionable bag or dress or something, and it does absolutely nothing, then that is a practical waste of money. If you innovate and you increase productivity and make the world a better place and more profitable and whatnot, then you've made a good choice. We have the moral foundation there for what is good and bad in those instances.
By creating demand. And while we're not to Adam Smith yet, the basic concept that demand creates supply and grows the economy is there in Barbin's work. But for us, his most important work is probably his arguments against mercantilism. Mercantilism was the driving political and economic theory in most of Europe in Barbin's day. Basically, it sort of saw nations as being in a state of perpetual economic war. The goal for any nation was to get as much literal gold and silver as it could for itself, and try not to give any to anybody else. In a broader sense, the object was to have your state be self-sustaining, importing as little as possible while exporting as much as you could. Colonies existed to feed the mother country, and weren't allowed to trade with any country other than their colonial power.
And this is kind of a complex moral argument. The benefits of a national economy versus a free trade environment, and there's going to be pluses and minuses involved, because when you necessarily isolate countries, it also makes war more likely between them. But that necessitates that there is some form of fair trade going on between the not just free trade but fair trade that's being balanced. And with all of the shenanigans that both sides can do involving debasing of their currencies when they have paper money, it's hard to say that free trade is really free in any of the environments that we have today, because half of any transaction is going to be some form of currency, right? And who controls the supply of currency? Well, a government does. And so governments today still engage in mercantilist like practices, defending of particular industries, manipulation of their currency in order to meet arbitrary employment goals. They do all sorts of things that, in my mind, precludes them from being considered actual free trade in the Adam Smith sense. But I agree to a certain degree that there are advantages to trade where they exist because of geographic differences or technological differences or labor supply differences, and there exists the potential for a more prosperous economy because of trade, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we get that automatic or that we have that right now, because governments exist, paper currencies can be manipulated, tariffs and other things exist, and it just isn't free trade in the sense that people would use the word in the real sense.
When imports had to be made, the goal was to only import raw materials so that they could be turned into more valuable finished goods in your country. And while today we see a lot of reasons why every country trying to produce every type of good is a terrible idea, in some ways mercantilism makes a lot more sense when you think of economies based on commodity money like gold or silver. After all, if your entire economy is based on gold and silver, then your economy can literally only be as big as the amount of gold and silver you have.
No, let's go back. Let's go back to the pile of gold. Your economy should revalue itself based on the available gold and silver. Just the same way that the price, just change these to a pile of apples. This is a pile of apples. Take away the gold and silver. If your country can't produce very many apples, and people want the apples, then each individual apple is going to be more valuable. You see how this works? If you have this big pile of apples, and apples are just coming out of everywhere, then each individual apple is not going to be worth as much relative to if the demand is the same by the populace. The demand is equal, right? The value of this is going to go down relative to the value of other things. So this whole notion of, oh my god, my economy can't be such and such size because I'm limited by this amount of gold, is just complete horse hockey. Because all that happens is, if I've got a big economy over here and I've got a small pile of gold, then each of these gold bars are really valuable. The same way that if I have a big economy over here and I've only got 6 computers, or I've only got 6 metal mines, or I've only got 6 drill presses, or 6 of anything, if I have a limited supply of anything, these things are going to increase in value. And so the economy is the same size, but the value of the individual pieces of gold and silver is larger when there's a smaller supply of it. It does not in any way limit the size of the economy unless you are measuring the economy solely based on the number of gold bars there are. And that's not a good way to measure the economy. A good way to measure the economy is to look at all of the material wealth that your economy has available to it. And so, if how much living space do you have? How much agricultural production do you have? How much human labor do you have? How many resources do you have that can be exploited? What is your productive capability? That is the true size of your economy. How it ends up being denominated is arbitrary. The size of the economy versus the number of people in it is the only true wealth value that you can make. So, how many goods and services do I have per person? That is wealth, not, how many bars of gold do I have? I mean, the bars of gold can be one of the categories, but you can have a big economy and have a small pile of gold that's very valuable, or you can have a small economy where, you've got a bunch of gold. There's not a direct connection between the two. Let's keep going.
The amount of gold and silver you have. While many were starting to see this dilemma, Barbon cut to the heart of it. He basically said that even gold and silver don't have innate value. They are just worth whatever the market values them at. So instead of stockpiling more gold and silver to grow your economy, why don't you just get rid of gold and silver entirely and move to paper money?
Because we've had to execute two heads of state for debasing the currency and stealing everyone's purchasing power that you mentioned 2 episodes ago.
But these ideas of Barbon's are only the beginning of the intellectual groundwork that will see a world accept slips of paper in exchange for a loaf of bread, a cell phone, or a house. Join us next time and we will witness somebody else try to put their own theories on paper money into practice, on the grandest scale.
Okay, as far as I'm concerned, they still have not resolved their moral dilemma that they kind of created in the first episode, which made gold and silver seem bad and paper money seem good. And as far as I'm concerned, the last 2 episodes, they've only dug that hole deeper by showing us actual cases where the opportunity for corruption within the paper money systems has actually led to outright armed revolts against the leadership. So basically, you're weighing the temporary value of a artificial boom in the economy based on fraud, effectively, and like maybe that fraud being gradually paid off over time and paid down, versus the threat of out and out, I have to get rid of my government because my government has been corrupted to such a point that they are debasing the currency and I can no longer work and live effectively because there's some arbitrary political authority that has corrupted the means of exchange. They haven't solved that moral dilemma yet. It still seems like the commodity currencies are better than the paper currencies because of this reason. And we'll see in the next episode if part 4 manages to reduce this, what I consider a stark problem between the two. But we'll see. I will see you guys next time.